Good afternoon, and welcome to this lecture by Dr. Patrick Deneen. It's entitled, How I Became a Christian Scholar. Please make sure your cell phones are turned off and put away. Thank you. This event is being co-sponsored by the Christian Faith and Scholarship Lecture Series and the Tocqueville program. I'm Jenna Story, and along with my colleagues Ty Tessitore and Ben Story, represent the Tocqueville program. I'd like to say a few words about the Tocqueville program before I introduce our speaker today. The mission of the Tocqueville program is to encourage serious and open engagement with the moral and philosophic questions at the heart of political life. We offer many opportunities for students to become involved in our activities, including a range of courses in political thought and 2 extracurricular groups, the Society of Tocqueville Fellows and the Political Thought Club. Every spring term, the Tocqueville program offers a special course that situates a contemporary issue in the context of the history of political thought. This course is aligned with a lecture series, so that participating students have the chance to meet and talk with scholars and public intellectuals currently grappling with the issue in question. Next spring, we will consider the nature of the relationship between Christian faith and political life. Details concerning the visiting speakers for this course can be found on the bookmark that you were handed as you walked through the door. And further information on all of our programs can be found on the table outside of this room. The Tocqueville program would like to thank Ginny and Sandy McNeil, Beth and Ravenel Curry, the AWC Family Foundation, and many other donors for recognizing the importance of a liberal education and for making our work possible. While the Tocqueville program is not aligned with any particular religious perspective, today we are pleased to partner with the Christian Faith and Scholarship Lecture Series to bring Patrick Deneen to campus. The Christian Faith and Scholarship Lecture Series is dedicated to exploring the influence of Christian faith on research and teaching. Their lectures offer the Furman community the opportunity to hear experts in various fields reflect upon how they have integrated their faith with their pursuit of knowledge. And so it is with great pleasure that I welcome Patrick Deneen to Furman today. Deneen is currently the David A. Potenziani Memorial Associate Professor of Constitutional Studies at Notre Dame University. He began teaching at Notre Dame in 2012, having been a professor for many years previously at Georgetown and at Princeton. Deneen also has a connection, a personal one, to our fine institution. He is a proud purple-wearing Furman dad. So in fact, he's really here for homecoming. We just roped him in. Dr. Deneen has an impressive traveling schedule, lecturing around the country and around the world, and an equally impressive list of publications. He has published 2 books, The Odyssey of Political Theory and Democratic Faith. Dr. Deneen has also edited 3 volumes and published countless articles in outlets ranging from Polity to the Weekly Standard to online journals that he himself helped to found, including the wonderfully named Front Porch Republic. As one might discern from that title, Deneen's work often focuses on the Tocquevillian theme of the necessity and the difficulty for citizens in a large-scale modern democracy to value the kind of interaction between family and community that can happen on places like the front porch. From his first book on Homer's Odyssey, Deneen reminds citizens in fast-paced, highly mobile societies like ours of the importance of resisting what he calls the siren song of cosmopolitanism, and remembering that rootedness, that investment and devotion to a particular place and tradition is not only an essential part of human happiness, but is paradoxically necessary to make our large-scale democracy work well. Deneen offers an ample selection of his work online, and if you look up his articles, as I encourage you to do, you will find that he is a master at provocation. Tomorrow we are hosting a discussion on an article of his that has ignited an intense scholarly debate. The essay is called Unsustainable Liberalism. Liberalism's contradictions are unsustainable, and we must see man and nature anew. This event will be an hour-long event beginning at 12:30 tomorrow in the Political Science room, the Political Science Seminar room, and you are all invited to attend. This afternoon, Deneen promises to allow us a privileged glimpse into his own scholarly life by giving us an account of how he became a Christian scholar. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Deneen.
Thank you, Dr. Story. Thank you, Brent Nelson and members of the Political Science Department and the Tocqueville program for the invitation. As I drove up to campus, I saw a big sign out front saying "Welcome Home," so I appreciate that too. It does really start to feel like home for me with a child here. Anywhere where you have a child feels a bit like home. He's right there, sitting right in front of me. I don't know where he is. My son Francis, who used to complain that his name was so unusual that no one could possibly know what that name was or meant. And now I think it's probably going to be one of the most popular names for young, certainly Catholic kids, for a long time to come. So you're welcome, son. The idea of hearing before you to speak on Christian scholarship must be making Richard Furman turn in his grave. First of all, he would wonder what happened. Why do you need someone to come to Furman to speak about Christian scholarship, since it was founded as a Baptist university, only disaffiliated, I think, in about 60 years ago or so. But then to turn to a Catholic professor from the University of Notre Dame would be adding insult to injury, since I think it was probably largely believed that Catholics and Christians weren't the same thing. So I'm delighted by the ecumenical and in many ways, I think, wonderful opportunity to be able to speak on this. And it's a topic that's ended up being interesting for me because I, in fact, I wouldn't really necessarily describe myself as a Christian scholar. It wouldn't have been the first way in which I would describe myself. It certainly wasn't how I began my life or vocation as a scholar and as a teacher. But I think maybe that here I have to acknowledge that Furman is wiser and more discerning than I am, since on reflection, and this really was an opportunity for me to reflect on this, what I write about, what I think about, and the way in which I write and think about it, I think couldn't take place except for as mediated through my faith as a Catholic Christian. But I think in many ways that this realization crept up on me a little bit like a frog being boiled slowly in a pot on a stove, that it took me a long time to realize it. Now, to be a Christian scholar today, as opposed to 60 years ago perhaps, increasingly is something that's unusual. You can even devote a lecture series to it, and increasingly requires not only some reflection, but even an explanation, and perhaps even a defense. There's a growing consensus in higher education, and I think we see this not only in higher education, but in society more broadly, that Christianity constitutes an obstacle to free inquiry, and in particular the central enterprise of scholarship, which is understood to be the skeptical, non-faith-based inquiry into all matters without constraint or obstacle. Generally understood under the banner of academic freedom, the reigning orthodoxy in higher education today understands its main activity to be free inquiry without any kind of influence from any religious belief of any kind, and therefore with a suspicion toward religious belief, and I think Christian belief in particular. Given Christianity's long-standing set of beliefs and certain set of truths, scholarship linked to Christian faith has become increasingly suspect in higher education, even to the point where recently a professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania named Peter Kahn argued in the flagship publication of higher education, the Chronicle of Higher Education, that a college like Wheaton College, which is one of those relatively few number of colleges that still have a religious affiliation with the evangelical Protestant tradition, Reformed evangelical Protestant tradition, school in Illinois, that it should have its accreditation revoked. So in other words, its recognition as a legitimate institution of higher education, that it should be revoked, which would effectively put it out of business or come close to doing it, because Kahn argues its stated Christian belief and expectation that its faculty should accord and agree with that belief actively interferes with scholarship. And as Kahn wrote in his article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I quote, "Skeptical and unfettered inquiry is the hallmark of American teaching and research. However, such inquiry cannot flourish, and in many cases cannot even survive, inside institutions that erect religious tests for truth. The contradiction is obvious," he wrote, and end of quote. Now, what's striking is that only a century ago, and even perhaps more recently, in most places it would be unthinkable to have, or even to require a lecture series like this. I mean, you might have a lecture series which would be focusing on atheism in scholarship. It would be so unusual to be able to think about this. Only 61 years ago, Furman disaffiliated from its Southern Baptist roots, and similar timeframes, roughly within the last 100 years, apply to most of the nation's 1,000-plus private institutions, almost all of which began as religious institutions founded in a religious tradition. And we still see that remnant, even where that affiliation doesn't exist anymore, in all kinds of ways in which these institutions are organized. Just think for a moment on the title that you may call many of your faculty here on campus. Maybe you call them doctor here, but if you call them professor, the reason you call them that is that at one time they professed a faith. Maybe they still do. That was the reason you would call them by that name. Or maybe you've had to visit a dean. This is a kind of corruption and a shortening of the word deacon, which again was another office within the religious within a religious institution. Not to mention, of course, the various kinds of designs, medieval designs of buildings, and even the long robes that faculty will wear, usually 1 or 2 times a year at graduation ceremonies and the like, all reflect this long-standing tradition in which scholarship and Christianity and religion would go and were thought to be closely aligned together. So to be in a situation now to have to reflect on how scholarship and Christianity can go together, and in the context of a space in which they are now regarded increasingly as contradictory, signals a seismic shift that's taken place in higher education and in society more broadly. That's only, I know for those of you who are young don't think this is that old, but only within about the last half century, and if that. Now, it took me a good many years to understand the nature of this shift, and I'm still trying to understand it. And to find out, as I began to understand it more deeply, not only that I disagreed with this transformation, but that the faith of my childhood, the faith in which I was raised, and my Catholic faith, doubtless informed my skepticism of this transformation, and increasingly became the resource that I turned to that allowed me to develop a critique of the spirit of this age and allowed me to think in certain ways more deeply, and I think more in a way that wouldn't have been available to me without that faith. So it's difficult for me to say whether it was my faith, a faith that I didn't initially think was going to be a part of my scholarship, that spurred my critique, or whether my critique deepened my faith. And I suspect in the end it was a mutually reinforcing dynamic. As my disquiet and discomfort and indeed unhappiness with the direction of higher education, led by the assumptions of our age, deepened, and my understanding of that disquiet became much more central to my scholarship and way of thinking, I realized that the answer to my unhappiness, as it had been all along, was relatively less important to me when I was in graduate school, was in fact a reflexive but unreflective faith, an ambivalent but not deeply formed theological understanding, and a belief that at the time when I began graduate school I thought was in some way separate from my work as a scholar. So to arrive at this point, to give a lecture on my Christian scholarship, is for me to, in fact, have to acknowledge the ways in which this faith, in fact, has deeply informed my own critical outlook on the age. But I also have to acknowledge that there was no road to Damascus moment, like Paul on the road to Damascus, in which this kind of suddenly struck me. It was rather the slow accumulation of realizations that so many of what I came to understand to be the reigning orthodoxies, even the faith commitments of our modern age, were in fact deeply misguided. And my own dawning understanding that much of the contemporary worldview derived not just from a fundamental rejection of Christianity, but a fundamental rejection of all of the deeper insights into the human person and the way in which we organize society that derive from that understanding. So I became a Christian scholar, not because I expected to or even intended to, but because in many ways, that's where my scholarship led me. It led me to Christianity, or to a deeper understanding of and commitment to my Christianity, to my faith. But also, it's where my Christianity has led me, to the scholarship that I've undertaken. So that's just by way of introduction. Let me proceed in two parts. Let me offer a very abbreviated statement of my disquiet with really kind of focusing on just certain features of what we could say modern assumptions of the modern faith. And I don't want to dwell at length on these concerns, but to lay them out in a very brief summary. And I'm happy to come back and discuss these at greater length. Or if you want to talk about them a little bit longer, there's a session tomorrow on unsustainable liberalism. So I'm just going to posit these. But then I want to dwell a little bit longer in the second part on a kind of abbreviated, almost intellectual autobiography of my own dawning realization of the nature of the age by looking at four representative thinkers that have helped me to see more clearly the nature of the age in which we are entering and to understand the constructive alternative that Christianity offers. But since I'm operating in fours, I'll have four thinkers that I want to talk about briefly. Let me mention what I regard as four of the deepest modern assumptions, the assumptions of our age, that are the source of this disquiet. And the first of these, and perhaps the most central and animating, is the contemporary understanding of freedom. Everyone is in favor of freedom. I don't know of many people who are against it. But what is it that we mean by freedom? Freedom, I think, in general, if you were to poll your classmates or talk with friends, is in general understood to be, or near universally understood to be, the absence of external constraint or control or obstacle. The autonomy of the liberated self to act freely without any kind of external obstacle or prevention, except insofar as it might cause harm or injury to another. Now, this conception of freedom, and I won't spend a lot of time developing this, has its roots in the philosophy of the early modern period. In particular, those of you political philosophy students among you, the thought that was inaugurated in the social contract tradition of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And it contains a normative vision of freedom from that philosophical tradition, which pictures human beings in a free state, a free condition, absent law, absent any kind of political forms of constraint or social forms of constraint, so that freedom is the absence of external obstacle. And what I want to suggest is that this is a relatively new phenomenon or new understanding of freedom that represents a sea change in the understanding of freedom that had preceded it. Secondly, materialism. Following from this understanding of freedom, there comes to be no way to rank our desires, right? No way to rank the things that we want. So society becomes increasingly organized around the effort to expand as much as possible the capacity of people to pursue any and all desires, and thereby to minimize friction that might result from a shortage of opportunities to pursue our various freedoms. The result is an emphasis upon expanding the material conditions that are seen as the best way of promoting individual liberty, and thereby a corresponding rise of materialism as the main form in which that pursuit of liberty is achieved. Today in modern America, we tend to think that there's a pretty radical divide between the political left and the political right regarding the various beliefs and the various stances that they hold. But one of the things that they share, I think, in a very deep and often unnoticed way, is that both tend to hold that the nature of freedom is basically materialistic. Now, they differ on how that should be best manifest. Those on the political right tend to defend quite extensively freedom of materialism within the economic realm, that the economic realm is the primary realm in which our freedom is experienced, and there should be a minimum of interference and obstacle, particularly from the government, in the pursuit of our economic desires. While those on the political left advance, in particular, a vision of freedom of the human person, and in particular, our sexual being, our freedom to act as we wish with our bodies. Both of these ideals are premised upon the idea that we should be able to dispose and use our property as we wish. Just a question of what we own, what we own outright, whether it's our stuff or our bodies. But at base, both are informed by the modern definition of freedom, that it is the absence of an obstacle, and thereby leads to a deeply and profound embrace of a basic material way in which our freedom is manifested. Third, utilitarianism. The main means by which we secure the expansion of freedom and enjoyment of all possible goods in the material realm is a utilitarian mindset and set of practices that applies instrumental rationality in order to overcome obstacles and challenges to achieving our desires. The basic utilitarian insight is that the main aim of life should be to increase pleasure and decrease pain. And this aim reshapes many institutions and activities of modern life. This, in turn, makes things like deferred gratification difficult, because that's painful. Right? Rather take out debt now than have to wait. And it makes the acceptance of some amount of pain and even suffering as a part of a fully lived human life increasingly unthinkable and unjustifiable, even when to go through some pain and suffering can make the ultimate outcome potentially a greater experience of joy and satisfaction. Fourth, and lastly, and I could go on with this at greater length, but I'm just going to line these up really quick. The best way to achieve all of these ways of forms of living, freedom, materialism, and utilitarian mindset, is by increasing individualism and separation in all spheres of life. Society needs to be reorganized along highly rationalized and homogenized lines that allows for the fullest differentiation of our roles and activities. We see this in the economic realm, an increasing specialization of our forms of labor. We see it increasingly in many spheres of life as well, not only in the economic, but think also in the political realm, where a growing set of bureaucratic arrangements and organizations are required because of increasingly specialized and isolated forms of work. Now, each of these four manifestations of contemporary belief, I think you can see evidently and indeed at the heart of the transformation of modern institutions of higher education. And I want to say this because many of you students assume that things are the way they are in a certain way because that's the way they always were. But these forces are reshaping higher education, and if we understand education to be, in many ways, how a civilization continues to perpetuate itself, then the way in which we see these forces changing higher education, we can expect to see civilization transforming as well. These originally Christian institutions have had to be reshaped and reformed by these sets of forces in order to conform to these sets of forces. And it was really initially through these changes that I was able to discern the connected nature of the way in which these forces were at work. First, we see in our modern understanding of freedom the move at most universities to move away from what was once a core curriculum. That is to say, the expectation that there should be a certain set of texts, subjects, and disciplines that every educated human being should have a familiarity with. We also see this in the withdrawal of the university from the responsibility and duty from at some level shaping the character of students and a nervousness about even the language of character. This was first manifest in the move away from in loco parentis, those of you who might know this phrase, where the university would stand in the place of parents, that they would in some ways take over from the parents when the parents would hand their children over to these institutions, and a correspondingly increasingly hedonistic culture that reigns in colleges today. We even have official rankings of the best party schools. I don't know how Furman does on that. I hope really low. Secondly, regarding our materialism, we see the near unanimous assumption that college is mainly about career preparation. What parent hasn't talked to you about, what are you majoring in? Is that practical? Can you get a job doing that? Really? Ballet? Is that going to be a good major? That is, that education is narrowly about preparing the young to make money. This impulse is on the verge of being formalized by the Obama administration, which has proposed a rating system that would evaluate colleges in significant part based upon the earning power of their graduates. So imagine an institution that produced, for example, social workers or teachers or priests. They'd have to get out of that business pretty quickly. Third, regarding utilitarianism, we see a growing utilitarian impulse on campuses where there is a resulting emphasis upon STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, often at the expense of humanities and the liberal arts, that is to say, practical subjects that can get you something, that can achieve something, are increasingly seen as at the heart and at the center of an institution's activities, whereas the humanities and the liberal arts are increasingly deemed to be ornamental and even laughably irrelevant. And again, President Obama, dismissively in an address to universities, dismissed art history majors as somehow being in any way relevant or practical. He apologized afterwards for that, but I think it revealed his true sentiment. And I use President Obama as an example of someone, not because I'm trying to diss President Obama, but because I do think this reflects the kind of governing elite opinion regarding what higher education should look like. And lastly, as the organizing principle on campuses today is increasing specialization. In the first case, and most obvious case, among faculty. I hope that you don't see too much evidence of that here, but doubtless there is some. That is to say, the main work of faculty is increasingly specialized research. And research is the main activity of what faculty are to be expected to be engaged in, and not necessarily teaching. But a second and corollary to this, as faculty become more specialized, this requires an explosive growth in college administration, the bureaucracy that most of you probably have a lot of familiarity with, which constitutes the single greatest personnel growth on campuses today. It's not faculty that are growing, it's administration. And not uncoincidentally is one of the main drivers of increasing tuition costs, something that I'm feeling quite personally. The place then that I have occupied most of my adult life, the universities, have undergone an extraordinary transformation from institutions that were once largely affiliated with the Christian churches, and thus not uncoincidentally were places devoted to teaching a core curriculum focused upon great works in a shared tradition, which aimed at shaping the character of the whole person, not just preparing a person for a job, but preparing a person to live a life in families, a life in communities, a life as a citizen, and a life hopefully oriented toward citizenship in the city of God. Institutions which encourage students to think not just about their job, but about a vocation, not simply money-making, but the way in which their work would contribute to the good of their communities in an ongoing way. Institutions that focused on the liberal arts and humanities, because this was one of the ways that faculty shared in the education of their students, a common commitment that was not simply in the role as specialists, but which were committed to something called the humanities, that is to say, something oriented to educating human beings, and thereby resisted fragmentation and specialization, but actually created something called a college, which if we think about what that word means, comes from the Latin word collegium, a community, which what a college was, and not, as it increasingly is organized today, as siloed faculty and increasingly siloed students, whose main allegiance is to their disciplines, rather than to their institutions, rather than to the collegium. Now, I came to understand these interconnected broader forces mainly through my membership, participation, vocation as a college teacher, but also through the texts that I've been very fortunate to teach, the core texts of my discipline, political philosophy. And those of you who aren't doing these political philosophy, there's brochures out there, these political philosophy discussion groups and clubs, you're really missing out. You should get a refund from, well, you shouldn't get a refund. You should have to pay twice as much because you should subvent this. I was profoundly fortunate that what I study and what I teach put me continually into contact with the great works by great minds that see to the heart of these issues. Not simply that I was participating in this transformation, but that I could understand it. I compare it to like being Neo at the end of the Matrix. I could see all the ones and the zeros, because that's what political philosophy allows you to do. My wife complains about going to the movies with me, because I can't just watch the movie. You actually have to see the ones and the zeros. You can see how all these factors are working. And as I understood more deeply the transformation of an institution like the modern university, it allowed me then to enter more deeply into an understanding of these forces and, as a result, an encounter with the alternatives offered by my Christian faith. So let me mention 4 authors in particular, give you a little reading list, those of you who want to do some homework afterwards, that were my guides, or at least 4 of them who were my guides. And these are going to be maybe slightly odd thinkers that I'm going to mention. One of them isn't even a Christian, although it said Thomas Aquinas baptized him. That's Aristotle. And only one of them is arguably really, we would recognize as a real Christian thinker, I guess, which would be Augustine. And the other 2 are Tocqueville and Wendell Berry, who's a poet and an essayist. So let me mention the first of these, my non-Christian thinker, Aristotle. Now, in no way am I going to do justice to any of these 4 thinkers. I just want to mention one thing by each of these thinkers. Let me focus on just one line from his book, The Politics, that arrested me when I first read it, and which I continue to think about during my years as a professor. This line takes place at the end of the 2nd chapter of Book 1 of The Politics. And if you guys haven't read The Politics, you should realize you have one of the world's authorities on Aristotle sitting here right in the front row, Professor Tai Tessitor, who's a treasure of a scholar on Aristotle. So take his classes on Aristotle. At the end of the 2nd chapter of the first book of Aristotle's Politics, this is what Aristotle writes. For just as man is the best of the animals when perfected, so he is the worst of all animals when he is separated from law and justice. For injustice is most pernicious when possessed of weapons, and man is born possessing weapons for the use of wisdom and virtue, which it is possible to employ entirely for opposite ends. There's a lot packed in here, okay? Hence, when devoid of virtue, man is the most unholy and savage of animals, and the worst in regard, get this, to sex and food. How does he end up? Virtue, all this stuff, sex and food. Okay, what's he saying here? What he's pointing to is that human beings, like any animal, have these really elemental instincts. And I probably don't have to tell you what these are. Sex and food, right? We have these desires. And that human beings, when they are ungoverned, when they're not governed by law, or we could even say more broadly, custom, that shapes them into a life of virtue, that these most immediate and most pressing appetites will be pursued even more savagely than the beasts pursue them. Even more savagely. Because humans, he said, have a particular set of tools, our rationality, our intellect, which can be directed by a kind of shaping and a formation to a kind of excellence. But if not so directed, actually make their the likely abuse of these appetites even worse to contemplate. So when governed by good law and by good custom, our fulfillment of these basic appetites, and he uses these as examples, but we could spin these out to include many others as well, that our fulfillment of these basic appetites actually perfect our nature. They make us most fully human, not worse than beasts, but most fully human. Now, who has not attended a very fine meal, and maybe you haven't yet, you're still young, but if you haven't yet, I hope you will. If you have attended a very fine meal with all the finery, the nice tablecloths, all the forks and knives all set out in the right spot, the really intimidating number of forks and spoons and knives, with sparkling silver and glistening crystal glasses, and not be amazed, if you think about it, at how human beings have arranged to do something that's so basic, just fill our maw. fill our bellies. Right? That something so splendid could be arranged to fulfill something so basic. And this is what Aristotle's talking about, that something so basic can become something so magnificent that make us fully human. And who, perhaps among you, maybe someday, has not participated in the joy of the culmination of a very fine courtship? When a man and a woman wed to begin life together as a family, formalized by the custom and the consent and the sacrament of marriage, like a fine meal, something beautiful that elevates a basic instinct, makes it into something fine. Aristotle is pointing to a distinctive definition of liberty that we can contrast with the one that I began talking about. A definition that you find consistently in the classical philosophers and in the Christian tradition, that liberty is the condition of self-rule, of self-governance, the achievement of a kind of discipline of self-rule that accords with the most godlike and rational part of our natures, when our basest instincts are governed by the highest part of ourselves. Liberty, then, as the moderns understand it, as the absence of obstacle, is regarded by somebody like Aristotle, in fact, as a form of slavery. When you pursue your basest instincts or desires, you actually make yourself less than fully human. You are actually in a condition akin to slavery, because one is ruled by one's basest appetites rather than governing them through the higher part of oneself. So for Aristotle, education must be focused above all on the cultivation of virtue, by which humans learn the discipline of self-governance of ourselves, and shared self-governance as a society together. Aristotle would not be surprised that a society that embraced our definition of freedom, the freedom to do as one wishes, would be plagued by problems of sex and food. Plagued by problems of sex and food, such as the horrible incidences of sexual assault that seem to be taking everywhere at every college campus in America. I don't know out here. Notre Dame has this problem. Or the major challenge of obesity and associated diseases that have become such a major health challenge in contemporary America. It's striking. If we don't govern these basis instincts, they will come back to haunt us. Let me move to the second thinker who helped me understand our condition and more deeply appreciate the Christian alternative. And this one is really Christian. I think there will be no debate. Maybe Aristotle could be not quite Christian. Again, I think he was baptized by St. Thomas Aquinas. But this thinker is St. Augustine, who I teach nearly every year. Again, there are a wealth of insights, lots of pages in Augustine, but let me just focus on one famous passage from his masterpiece, The City of God. The City of God was written as an answer in the aftermath of the fall of Rome to the accusation that Christianity had weakened the pagan virtues that had made Rome great. Augustine argued that Rome was in fact never great because it did not understand the proper orientation of human aspiration, which was ultimately an encompassing communion with God. Augustine then famously distinguished between two cities, to which the city of God and the city of man, and articulated what made them distinct, that each was distinguished by a different form of love. As he wrote in Book 14 of the City of God, and I'm going to quote, "The two cities, therefore, were created by two loves. The earthly city, by love of oneself, even to the point of contempt for God. The heavenly city, by the love of God, even to the point of contempt for self. The first glories in itself. The first city glories in itself. The second glories in the Lord. The first seeks glory from human beings. God, who is the witness of the conscience, is the greatest glory of the other." Two loves guide the two cities. Pride in the city of God, love of self, love of other, to the point of contempt of self in the city of God. Augustine then, in some fundamental ways, corrects or perhaps perfects ancient philosophy. Ancient political philosophy held that the highest political virtue was justice, but at the same time acknowledged that this was rarely, if ever, achievable by human cities. Most cities, in fact, political communities, are disordered oriented by some form of hubris or self-love. Justice, it turns out, is a nearly impossible standard because no human being can say with any kind of accuracy what it actually is. What is justice? Right? This is why Plato begins the Republic. He has spent 300 pages, and at the end of that book, I'm not sure we get an answer. That's what's frustrating about reading Plato, among other things. Right? What is justice? Is justice treating people equally? That might be the answer for many today. I think that lies behind, for example, the phrase social justice. We should treat people equally. Well, is it just to treat everyone equally? Do you really want to be treated equally? Do you not want to be rewarded for your merits? Would it be okay with you if Professor Tessitore gave everyone in class an A? I guess it probably would be. How about if you gave everybody in class a C? That would be equal, regardless of how much work you put into the class. Don't we want to be rewarded for our merits? Don't you want to get into the college or graduate program that you deserve to get into? Do we really want to be treated equally? Is justice equal? Probably not, or at least problematically, only problematically if so. Is justice then receiving just rewards, what one deserves? Wouldn't this be what justice is? Well, if that's the case, this would then require a kind of godlike wisdom to know what we deserve. We would need the perfect judge to be able to look into your soul and say, you deserve a B minus plus minus in this class. You may suspect sometimes your professors are not entirely wise, discerning judge when it comes to grading your papers. But there's a reason for that, because they're not Platonic philosophers. And Plato has to acknowledge this, that to be able to achieve perfect justice in which we received exactly what we deserved would require the creation of an all-knowing, all-discerning philosopher king. But this is impossible. And so justice may be impossible. Ancient philosophy, or ancient political philosophy, acknowledges a kind of impasse. Augustine offers a kind of corrective because he understands the deepest meaning of the incarnation of Christ. Christ's sacrifice on the cross, which if I were at Notre Dame, I could point to where it is on the wall, but I'm not there. His sacrifice on the cross is finally an acknowledgement of the insufficiency of justice as a perfect standard. Were humans to be treated justly by God, we could expect, indeed we might look outside right now, for the imminent return of some form, different form of the flood, locust or plague or something. If we humans were treated justly by God, it would require perhaps the complete annihilation of this ungrateful and undeserving creation, which was created in the image and likeness of God, but altogether insufficient to show gratitude adequate to its creator. I mean, just think of the Jews. Every 5 minutes, God shows up and says, here's how you have to act. And they say, okay, God, we'll act this way. And then 5 minutes later, they're off worshiping a golden calf. Well, we're really no different than the Jews when it comes to this. 5 minutes later, we're worshiping the golden calf. What did God do then? Did he give us what we deserved? No. He sent his only Son to participate in the human condition, to know our frailties and our shortcomings, our weakness and our temptations, our aches when you wake up in the morning, our emotions and our appetites. And then he did this, as expressed by Paul in his letter to the Philippians. Christ, being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, the same word as slave, being made in human likeness. And being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Justice is not only finally an impossible standard, but an insufficient one. The standard that Augustine points to is Christian love, that great faith, hope, and love that are mentioned by Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians. Because love demands us to go beyond justice, not merely to what we deserve, but rather a standard of Christ-like imitation in self-sacrificial love. Gift and not desert is the Christian standard. And so the basic institutions of human society that we can point to as making a difference as to whether human beings flourish or not, many of them within a Christian context were created not because of desert, but out of charity. Think of, the basic institution of human society, the family, or one's community, schools, universities, hospitals, orphanages, all these many institutions that cared for the disabled, the infirm, the elderly, the weak, those who lacked power. All of these, in many ways, are simply the result of a society based not around desert, but around gift. As society moves away from this aspiration, it becomes harder and crueler and colder. Our universities today are becoming more perfectly organized around the idea of desert, what you deserve. It sifts winners and losers with ever greater efficiency, who will win the meritocratic race of life, and is a participant in dividing the nation into between an overclass and an underclass, who increasingly live at a greater divide from one another. Augustine, I think, helps us to see exactly what the corrective is. The third thinker who I would point to as having helped me understand this alternative and deepen my own understanding of my faith, that guy, Alexis de Tocqueville, a favorite here at Furman, as he should be everywhere. Now again, 700-page book, 2 volumes, Democracy in America. That's just one of the things he wrote. A lot of things we might talk about. Let me just take one thing to mention. His concern with what he calls restlessness, inquiétude in the French, which kind of means the inability to be still, the inability to be at rest, the inability to have leisure. In one of the greatest passages in Democracy in America, which is in chapter 13 of part 2, volume 2 of Democracy in America, it's a chapter called Why Americans Are So Restless in the Midst of Their Prosperity. This is what Tocqueville writes, and he could have just been walking around in the streets today as he writes this. I quote, "In America, I saw the most enlightened and freest people placed in the happiest circumstances that the world affords. It seemed to me as if a cloud habitually hung upon their brow, and I thought them serious and almost sad, even in their pleasures. It is strange to see with what feverish ardor the Americans pursue their own welfare and watch the vague dread that torments them, lest they should not have chosen the shortest path which leads them to their happiness. A native of the United States clings to this world's goods as if he were certain never to die, and he is so hasty in grasping at all within his reach that one would suppose he is continually afraid of not living long enough to enjoy them. He clutches everything, but holds nothing fast, but soon loosens his grasp to pursue fresh gratifications. In the United States," he goes on, "a man builds a house in which to spend his old age, and he sells it before the roof is on." This is like Flip That House, right? A very popular show. We have a whole genre devoted to this. He plants a garden and leaves it just as the trees are coming into its bearing. He brings a field into tillage and leaves other men to gather the crops. He embraces a profession and gives it up. He settles in one place, which he soon leaves afterwards to carry his changeable longings elsewhere. Death at length overtakes him, but it is before he is weary of his bootless chase of that complete felicity, happiness, which forever escapes him." End quote. What Tocqueville describes then in these passages in this fantastic chapter is what we might call a kind of institutionalized discontent that marks our age. This is a direct result of the freedom, as we understand it, that is the centerpiece of our time. The freedom to define who we are, what we are, as the resultant accumulation of our choices. And not as an aristocratic time, as the result of some inheritance or membership in a family or in a chain that links generations, or someone from a particular place, Alexis de Tocqueville, Alexis from the estate of Tocqueville. The freedom that we enjoy, on the one hand, is a great privilege in one respect, but it is a freedom that breeds intense and endless anxiety. Have I made the right choices? Have I pursued the right things? Have I chosen the right career? Have I settled in the right place? Have I dated or married the right person? Steve Jobs understood this perfectly, this fact about modern human beings. Do I own finally the right iPhone? Or will there be an iPhone 2763? Just two or 3 years from now. The more opportunities are open to us, the less likely it is that we are satisfied. But in fact, the more likely it is we become more anxious and more unhappy. The pursuit of happiness, that ringing phrase from the Declaration, becomes increasingly just pursuit, with happiness fading ever more as we accelerate to achieve it. Tocqueville urges his readers to resist this spirit of the age, in significant part by raising our eyes above the spirit of the age, and particularly by finding a form of contentment with those people we might happen to find ourselves with our families, in our communities, and our local circumstances, from which much satisfaction might be attained. Christianity, of course, offers a particular form of solace and offers to our eyes the example of many holy men and women who are driven on one hand by a kind of longing and even restlessness, something Augusta describes with beauty, but a restlessness for communion with God, an understanding that it's a longing that can never be filled by the things of this world. Recognition of this kind of sacred restlessness can lead to a remarkable form of peacefulness as we traverse our path in this world, one that we can witness in the exemplary lives of many saints, such as that one on the lips of so many today, Francis, or Franciscans here. A man who, in many ways, sought to teach the world what it was to live a life of contentment with so little. Lastly, let me mention the name of a thinker who helped me also to understand this predicament we live in, the Kentucky poet and novelist and essayist and farmer, Wendell Berry. Unlike the others I've spoken about, he's neither dead nor not writing anymore. He's still writing out in his farm in Kentucky. Berry speaks to all of these themes I've discussed this far, and in many ways really helps, I think, as readers put them together, but frames them in a particularly pointed critique of the organization and deepest assumptions of our modern industrial economy and the supporting political, social, and educational system that has been designed in many ways to support it. He is especially a severe critic of ignorance, the ignorance that is a requirement of modern organizations that lead us to believe that we are the opposite of ignorant, that we are deeply learned. That is, the more specialized and segmented our various jobs and roles become, the greater the depth of our ignorance about what the actual impact of our actions are and what our complicity in abuses and degradations might be. In all of his various kinds of writing, his essays, his novels, his poetry, he has urged his readers to overcome their ignorance by recommending different patterns of economy and different ways of living that encourage us to make connections between all of our various activities and all of our various actions. He writes, for example, I quote from Berry, quote, "The industrial economy requires the extreme specialization of work, the separation of work from its results." How many of you might hope to get a job in a company where you'll have no idea what it is the company's actually doing? Right? Increasingly like life in a university. Right? Increasingly requires the extreme specialization of work because it subsists on divisions of interest and must deny the fundamental kinships of producer and consumer, of seller and buyer, of owner and worker, of work and product, of material and product, of nature and artifice, thoughts and words and deeds. This quote is drawn from a wonderful essay by Berry called "The Two Economies," in which he points out one of the most fundamental divisions of our age is the separation of the enterprise that we call the economy from what he calls the great economy. We have this thing called the economy, but we don't see it as taking place within something called the great economy, which he points to as the comprehensive order of creation, which he says might be better captured in the phrase, the kingdom of God. The economy treats the world as inert stuff and treats human beings as basic laborers. It invents processes that allow for the most efficient and profitable extraction and refinement of these materials, while generating a host of consequent problems and side effects that it treats as entirely separate, as if they were somehow appeared out of nowhere, that now require new industrial processes in order to redress. So the depletion of resources, environmental degradation, the creation of large hypoxic zones due to fertilizer runoff, the declining usefulness of antibiotics so that we can feed our cattle corn, which is not their natural food, etc. I could keep on going. These are treated as problems that are regarded as separate from their causes and need a set of industrial processes to solve. So that we, in turn, generate a host of new problems that demand science and technology continually run ahead of, rather than address the root cause of our ignorance. Arising then from our denial that there is a kingdom of God and that we are creatures in that creation, we instead seek to make ourselves its Lord and Master, engaged in what early modern thinkers described as a war on nature, aimed at its mastery and conquest. But as Barry writes, if indeed we are at war with nature, then we need to recognize that it is war in the fullest sense, and that reports from the front suggest that we are not winning. Now, I can only offer a taste. It's probably longer than you wished, but a taste of these various thinkers that have moved me to what eventually I realize is more fully, and indeed the most fully engaged form of Christian scholarship of which I think myself capable, although I know there's always somewhere deeper to go. What you might have noticed is that I haven't talked very much, just a little bit, about the book, the Bible, and the record of the chosen people and the actions of our Savior upon the earth and the efforts of the early church to live in witness of Christ's sacrifice. But everything that I have described as alternatives to our reigning orthodoxies are to be found in that book as well. And in many ways, I had to come to that book through a lot of other books. My understanding of that book had to be deepened by other books first. So I conclude by admitting, like Augustine, that I, and as we all are mysteries to ourselves. Was I drawn to these sort of books and these arguments because I was raised a Christian? Or did I become more deeply committed Christian because of what I read in these books and others like it? The answer probably lies in a strange alchemy bubbling between the patterns laid down in my soul and the power of arguments that help me to see and understand where my heart ought to lie. But in the end, I can only commend the words that Augustine heard as he himself sought out the faith of his mother after a lengthy and fruitless search elsewhere and everywhere, but in the life of the imitation of Christ. The words that he heard chanted, "Tole lege," take up and read. Thank you.
Thank you, and we have a bit of time for a few questions for Professor Deneen. So, ask away. If I can remind you to repeat the question.
Okay, sure. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Deneen. It's very interesting, but you made a point on specialization. And so you said that you talked about how modern ignorance seems to be a result from this focus on this mindset of specialization. But is it really is that really the problem, or is it the fact that people themselves are hubris filled? So in other words, is specialization incompatible with the virtues you've listed?
Yeah.
Or is it just the fact that people themselves are unable to remedy the two?
So, excellent question. The question is specialization really the problem, or is the problem in a way a kind of hubris that always informs the human heart and makes it difficult for us to get beyond our own ignorance, our own blinkers? And I think that's a fantastic question. And if I were to turn to Scripture here, so that I think provides in some ways a kind of an effort to answer that. Probably my favorite passages in entire Scripture that I'm really drawn to are those passages in the first letter of Corinthians by Paul, in which he's addressing the Corinthians, who it seems are just fighting over who's the most important, right? So he's talking in many ways about specialization, right? This problem has been with us for a long time, right? It's not new. There are some people who are engaged in prophecy, and they say, we're the most important members of the church. And there's some people engaged in preaching. They're saying, we're the most important people. And there's some people who are speaking in tongues, and they say, we're the most important members of this church. And what Paul writes is to say, look, you're all part of the same body. You are all part of the same structure. You're all necessary for our church, for our society, for our community to thrive. Right? The problem is that each of you is assuming your portion of the work is the entirety of the work. So that somehow you, the hand, think that you can just be the hand and go walking away. Or you, the head, can just go rolling away your way. Right? He says even the less decent parts of the body have their uses as well. Right? That everything is required. Every part of the body is required for the body to be the body. So the problem or obstacle is in many ways the division of labor or this form of specialization. But the solution is actually, or the solution lies in the specialization, which is to say our realization that there is no whole without the parts that compose it. The temptation is to assume that the parts constitute the whole. And so Paul's call, and I think it's interesting, it echoes very much kind of Plato's call in the Republic as well. The call is to say you have to see yourself as part of the whole. That part of your work needs to be seeing yourself as part of the whole. Now compare this to the image, interesting contrasting image that Adam Smith gives us in the Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith says, in order to be a thriving, functioning, profitable, wealthy society, each person should focus on their work, exclusively upon their work. And we let something he calls the invisible hand sort out how a whole comes into creation. So we have this hand that walks away by itself. Right? It will take care of organizing the whole. The market will take care of organizing the whole. Your job is to do your work. So you're absolutely right. The specialization, the challenges of specialization and the division of labor have always been with us. But I think one of the things that Christianity offers and suggests is that we have to see the ways that our work fits together and contributes to the good of the whole and not simply focus on what my particular job is or my particular task is. If I can put this within my own personal frame within the university, right, increasingly faculty are called upon to simply focus on their particular field and specialization. Our reward structure lies in producing specialized research, right, which is to say where the reward lies is not necessarily in being in the classroom. And it's not necessarily in helping to govern the university and having some knowledge of what it is we're producing, which is a human being, if I can put it in those crass terms. Right? We are, in fact, supposed to exist in a kind of structure in which we have our own invisible hand that's going to arrange for the education of students, because while we just focus on our particular tasks. So we are all functional, although we're very smart people with all our PhDs, we're actually asked to exist in what Wendell Berry would call a condition of ignorance, because we don't know what we're producing. We just know it's my job to put this head on this pin and send it down on the assembly line. Right? To the extent that we don't have those conversations, what are we doing to educate human beings? It means we are actually existing in an organization that promotes ignorance. And the consequences is that students are left to their own devices without any guidance about what constitutes an education. So I think that in many ways, you're absolutely right. The challenge is how do you not get rid of specialization, right? But how do you bridge it through a kind of responsibility that we have, right, to see the ways that our work fits together and not simply rely on some kind of invisible hand to solve the problems of our special talents and abilities. Great. Dr. Story.
In your citation of Berry, you quote critically Cartesian words, in which René Descartes calls us to seek out through science the mastery and possession of nature. And this is something that you speak about in Unsustainable Liberalism, this attitude of opposition toward nature that human beings have taken up in the modern age. We no longer see ourselves as parts of a larger whole. And reading this, while I'm in many ways sympathetic to it, I'm just always reminded, like, well, wait a minute. The mastery and possession of nature has produced a science that has done marvelous things for us. You know, the reduction in maternal fetal mortality. Just these unquestionable blessings that have come through the Cartesian Baconian quest. So it's not as though we just sort of like, you know, arbitrarily declared war on nature. It doesn't real evils to be addressed.
Sure.
So, what do you say about that?
Yeah, no, it's the question Dr. Story asks, Ben Story asked me is whether or not a kind of critical perspective on this phrase, the mastery and possession of nature, doesn't neglect or elide the great contributions that the modern scientific and technological project have given to human beings. And I wouldn't gainsay that at all. And I think, I can't speak for Barry, but I don't think Barry would necessarily argue with the way in which you phrase this, which in many ways are many of the blessings of various technologies and scientific understandings. I mean, Barry is himself a farmer. Agriculture is a kind of scientific advance, right? We don't find cultivated fields just in nature, right? So it itself is a technology. And we could say that Barry, to the extent that he commends the cultivation of a kind of culture, a deep culture in which there's a kind of passing on from one generation to the next, forms of understanding and practices and traditions, that's also a kind of technology, if I can put it in those terms. In other words, this is not something one finds in nature, it's a kind of artifice. The question that Barry would ask is, to what extent do these creations out of human intellect accord with and comport with what we might say as the kingdom of God or the nature or the created order? And to what extent do they seek in some ways to impose a humanly conceived, almost Gnostic understanding of our mastery over that condition onto nature, and even seek to negate aspects of nature? And I think what that calls for is a kind of evaluation, an evaluation of in what ways do certain scientific advances and certain technological advances seek, for example, the example you give me, seek an end that is legitimate, in Aristotelian terms, health. Health is what our nature seeks, right? We seek a condition of health. And to what extent do we see those technological and scientific advances actually seeking a condition that is in many ways contrary to our nature? And this isn't just a theoretical question. When we think about contemporary debates in biotechnology, this is a very pressing set of questions, right? Do we desire certain kind of biotechnological advances that will bring human beings to a condition of health? We might say there are certain things that we would want to see. Can we identify certain kinds of disorders early and help to prevent them, right? Perhaps. Would that be a desirable thing? Perhaps. Can we increasingly manipulate the genetic code to create something that we might begin to think is no longer really quite human, right? Begin to splice in certain genetic features that we might find in other creatures, right? In order to give us the ability to live in oxygen-deprived areas or very cold weather places like South Bend, Indiana, for example. We can begin to imagine, almost, sort of, what's the movie I'm thinking of? Gattaca-like outcomes in which you begin to create the possibility of a different race of human beings, truly distinct, increasingly distinct from what we might think of as human. Now, is that leading human beings to a condition of health? Or is that in some ways working, in some ways using technology against nature, right? Against what we might regard as human nature, in ways that we can doubtless suspect will produce all kinds of unintended consequences that we may not regard as fundamentally attached to those developments. So these are the kind of questions that we tend not to ask ourselves in our belief that all forms of scientific advance and technological advance are good things, right? So to the extent that those are live and pressing questions, I think the question of does this constitute a development that comports with nature, with the created order, or works actively against it, is something, an evaluation that I think Barry would call us to begin to make. One other thing. One way in which Barry points, and this is going to sound really weird to many of you, he has real admiration for the Amish. Because one of the things he admires about the Amish is that they have at least one way of evaluating science and technology and technological advances, which is the following question has to be answered. Will this scientific or technological advance help our community, keep the strength of our community together, or will it damage our community? Will it cause our community to begin to come apart? Right? And questions about introducing certain technological advances into the Amish society are evaluated on that basis. So they have certain things that they regard as acceptable technological advances. I don't know what the difference between buttons and zippers are, actually, but for example, one thing, this is going to sound like a weird technology, one technology they haven't accepted is insurance. It's a kind of technology, right? It's a kind of convention that we have, right? We recognize there are risks in the world, and so we pool together, we contribute a certain amount of money, and say that if something bad happens to you while you're driving, they'll take from the amount that I put into the pool, and you'll be made whole. And if my house burns down, we'll take from that part of the pool, and we'll make ourselves whole. The Amish looked at that particular technology, if I can call it that, and said, this is not going to help our community, because it's going to render our direct responsibility now nugatory, now obviate our direct responsibility to each other's fates. We'll become impersonally bound together, right? So that I don't have to actually know you to contribute to your insurance, right? If something bad then happens within the Amish community, it's the responsibility of the Amish community to help make that family, that person, those people whole again, to the extent that that's possible. And it's a personal responsibility. So we can see that there are ways of evaluating certain kinds of technologies in ways that we don't tend to do because we have a kind of faith that any conquest of nature is a good thing. And I think that's what Barry is pressing against in his own evaluation.
I have a question. So you warn about the problems of skepticism, and you touched on that at the beginning of your talk. But I mean, even in this example you just had with the Amish, they are being skeptical about this technology that's coming to them, and you in some ways seem to be skeptical about the liberalism that society is talking about or forcing upon us, or the capitalism in our society. And so, in what regards are you pushing back against skepticism? Is there still a place for it? Is there no place for it at all?
Yeah. The question is, in my own presentation, I've expressed skepticism toward a number of things, maybe the liberal project, some technological advances, and my talk began with I was raising questions about the skeptical nature, in particular perhaps of the academic enterprise. What I didn't, and actually I thought about giving a talk sort of about this, but I kind of wanted to give a little bit more of a personal talk. But I consider giving a talk on the ways in which these modern assumptions themselves constitute a kind of set of faith commitments, if I can call it that. Right? The idea that freedom is defined and is constituted by a kind of radical form of individual autonomy is itself a kind of faith commitment. It's a certain belief, right, that acts as a foundational assumption that guides our thinking about how society should be organized. Society should be organized around the premise that freedom is understood as the radical autonomy of the human self, and therefore it is something that is deserving of our pursuit and the way in which we should organize society. Now, why is that the case? Why do we hold that to be the case? Well, that's a deep assumption that's made. Right? Why does Hobbes start the Leviathan that's saying freedom is a condition in which there is no law? Against everything that's been argued up to that point in the classical and Christian tradition, which says that freedom is when one is governed rightly, is the free choice to choose that which is right, not simply what one wants in the most immediate sense. Right? There are certain base assumptions built into even the modern academic enterprise, right, which will talk about skepticism, but it won't be skeptical about its own assumptions. Right? It won't be skeptical about its assumptions of what constitutes a legitimate scholarship, right? Or what constitutes the legitimate organization of the modern university, or the legitimate organization of modern society. Right? Christianity begins with a different assumption. We are relational. We're relational creatures. Right? It has the image of the Trinity, that God is relational. God is relational with himself. God is 3 in 1. Get your brain around that crazy idea. Right? Why have that idea? Why posit that idea? Because even God himself, right, the most self-contained, right, creature that one could imagine, being that one could imagine, is relational. Because the nature of creation is relational. Everything is in relationship to everything else. So to begin with the assumption that there is something called a radical autonomous self is itself already a kind of faith commitment. So I'm not suggesting that one can abandon a kind of inquiry and questioning. What I am raising a question is whether or not the modern form of organizing institutions like modern educational institutions with the deepest assumptions of modernity aren't themselves harboring a deep set of faith commitments that in many ways only come to light when you bring the Christian perspective to bear. And so it's not accidental in many ways that we find an increasing antipathy between modern secular assumptions and Christian assumptions, because they are deeply in tension with one another. I think for a long time there was the belief and hope that they weren't. But I think increasingly it's becoming evident that in many ways they are. And at root, we can see that basic assumptions that are made, that perhaps in some respects are assumptions one has to make as a matter of faith, right, are deeply inform the worldviews, on one hand, that inform the modern understanding of the self and the way we organize society, and the Christian understanding of the self in relationship to others. Right? So I'm not suggesting we give up our ability to question and to analyze. What I am suggesting is that in many ways, modern institutions have made themselves in some ways immune from that form of questioning. And it's in many ways a kind of Christian witness and responsibility to raise those questions.